Hi, this is F. Paul Driscoll, Editor-in-Chief of Opera News, with another episode of Sightlines. My guest today is a great composer, a great American composer, John Adams. John, welcome.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about the world premiere of his brand new opera, Antony and Cleopatra, at San Francisco Opera, which happens on the 10th of September, I believe, among other things. But let's dive right in with Antony and Cleopatra. How did that idea come into your head? Who suggested it to you? What appealed to you about this subject?
Well, first of all, I suggested it to myself. In my last opera, Girls of the Golden West, which is about the California gold rush, in the course of research, we discovered that reciting Shakespeare was a very popular form of entertainment in California. In fact, Lola Montez, the provocative performance artist who started her career in Germany with King Ludwig, crazy King Ludwig, but his father, and who was had to escape a scandal in London, ended up performing in the Gold Rush area. So I said a couple of very short soliloquies from Macbeth in that opera, and I found that working with Shakespeare was a dream. No surprise, of course. I found that the language, the words suggested immediately musical ideas. And I had, for many, many years, had a special affection for the play, Antony and Cleopatra. It comes from that just astonishing period when Shakespeare wrote something like 4 or 5 of his greatest plays within a very, very short time period. And Matthew Schilbach, the wonderful executive director of the San Francisco Opera, asked me if I would be interested in writing an opera for the company's centennial, 100 years of opera in San Francisco. And so I proposed this idea.
As a play, it's a title, I think, that a lot of people know, but not too many people appreciate or understand exactly what's going on in the play. What is it that you wanted to bring out when you're setting it to music, for lack of a better phrase?
Well, of course, I think any opera composer is interested in the intensity of relationships, and particularly relationships that involve love and hate and very violent emotions. I think I was drawn to this play for a number of reasons. The first being that these characters are just, they're amongst the most extraordinary of Shakespeare's characters. And of course, that's really saying something. But they're lovers who are older people. Antony has his great career already behind him, and he just, it's as if he wants to go to Florida and drink Mai Tais and do nothing and have a good time. But of course, Rome needs his military expertise, and the young Caesar, it's actually historically at the time, his name was Octavian. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. He is now fighting what could possibly be a civil war in Italy, and they absolutely need Antony to come back. And then Cleopatra is for sure the most developed of all of Shakespeare's female characters. She's so full of shadings and colors and characteristics. She's a narcissist. She's a woman of immense intelligence, of political power, of craftiness. She's absolutely absorbed with trying to maintain her country and her own personal family at a time when Rome is simply just this, a juggernaut coming in and absolutely wasting countries. The analogies between what's going on in Ukraine right now are painful. And it's also an opera about politics. It's an opera about one, civilization that's ascendant, which is Rome. It's the beginning of the Roman Empire, and another one which is definitely in decline, which is, Pharaonic, Ptolemaic Egypt.
Had you ever, I mean, not had you ever, but was there a particular production of the play that you felt was successful in realizing those characters?
My experience with Shakespeare is very similar to my experience with opera, which is that I get my biggest hit by just sitting alone with the music, or in the case of plays, reading the play. I saw there was a nationally televised production of it that came from, I think, from London with Ralph Fiennes and a wonderful cast. But, I have my own mental images, and I think I looked at online some scenes from old productions on YouTube. There's the great actress Janet Sussman, who was actually South African, who was famous for doing Cleopatra back in the 1960s or so. But the women that I'm working with are fantastic.
Now, you had originally conceived this with Julia Bullock in mind, but she was not able to do it. And you have a wonderful Egyptian soprano,
Yes.
Amina Edris, if I'm
right.
pronouncing that correctly. How do you make those adjustments? I mean, is it something that when you have a different voice, do you rethink anything or wait till you hear them in rehearsal?
Well, I do like to work for specific artists in mind. I recently wrote a piano concerto for Yuja Wang, and I had her sort of stage presence and her particular musical gifts in mind. The great violinist Lila Josefovitz has inspired me to write violin music for her. And in the case of this opera, I knew immediately that I wanted Gerald Finley to be Antony. He did such a great role in creating Robert Oppenheimer and Dr. Atomic. And, Jerry's a singer sort of in his golden era, and he's not even remotely past his prime, which is the case with Antony. But I thought Jerry, a man who's probably in his early 50s or late 40s now, would be ideal for that. I wanted to write for Julia Bullock. She had probably the principal role in Girls of the Golden West, and we've also worked together on my oratorio El Nino. So I wrote it with Julia in mind. She has a very wide range. She has what she calls her Nina Simone range, which she can sing down to a low F sharp, which is sort of mezzo range, and then she can go all the way up into the stratosphere. And when she made that by now infamous phone call to me sometime, I forget when it was, I guess it was in the spring, saying, John, I'm pregnant. It threw us into an absolute panic because, we were only like about 4 or 5 months away from no, we weren't even 4. We were like 3 months away from rehearsals, and most talented singers are booked years in advance. But we were incredibly fortunate that we could have Amina Edris, whom I'd never heard of. She was a Merilla program singer here. This is a San Francisco opera program for developing young artists. And she was one of them, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. And there's a great deal of buzz about her. And she agreed to do it, even though she was in Paris at the time and singing 2 different operas. And She is a spectacular actress. She has a wonderful voice as well. But what's knocking me out about Amina is her ability to just be all of these different Cleopatras. She's sexy, she's paranoid, she's vulnerable, and she's at the end, of course, very clear-eyed about what her destiny is. As far as having to make adjustments, it was not a great problem. There were a few low notes that I had to find alternatives for because she didn't have quite the lower register that Julia has, but that's, it's a small thing. I think this is going to be a real breakout moment for Amina. And then, of course, as was the case with Eric Owens, who sang in 2 of my operas, I won't be able to get them anymore because they're superstars.
Well, that's a nice problem to have, I think, for
I
a
suppose
singer.
so.
Forgive me if this question seems a little bit awkward, but you've had such success doing operas about quote unquote real people in real life, whether it's Robert Oppenheimer or Mr. Klinghoffer or any of the people in Nixon in China. When you're looking at Antony and Cleopatra, who were real people, do you think of them as real, or do you look at them through the lens that Shakespeare gave you, that they're imagined in a slightly different way than the historical characters?
Well, I think, what draws me to Shakespeare is that they're intensely real people. They're perhaps magnified in their reality, but all 3 of these main characters, Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, are intensely shaded personalities. Caesar's young, he's very aggressive, he's always on message. He's annoyed at Antony because he admires him, and they had a very close kind of bro relationship when they were younger, and he feels sort of betrayed by him. And then, of course, the explosive relationship between Antony and Cleopatra is, I went back and watched the movie with Richard Burton and
Elizabeth Taylor.
Of not of Cleopatra, but of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf.
Oh, wow, yeah.
A great play by Edward Albee. Because I had a feeling that there might be that kind of, electricity and violence, emotional violence. But honestly, I don't think it can touch what these 2 people do on the stage. If you come to San Francisco, you'll see what I mean.
So for the people who are coming to San Francisco, and this is also going to be a co-production with the Met and with the Liceo in Barcelona in future seasons, is there any one particular moment or scene in the opera that you would call the prospective audience's attention to? I mean, something that really...
can't.
You can't?
I can't, because this is the set by Mimi Lean is just extraordinary, that how she's able to move from one scene to another, from one country to another, from one continent to another, and you just can't believe you're in the same opera. And Elkanah Pulitzer, my stage director, has drawn out incredible performing from all the actors. I am at a loss to say which is my favorite scene. I guess, as you said earlier, that's not a bad problem for a composer to have.
Is there any other Shakespeare opera that you admire? I mean, there are very few successful ones in English using his own language, but is there anything structurally or dramatically that you admire?
Well, it's interesting because I had been conducting several times the orchestra of the Santa Cecilia in Rome, and I didn't speak Italian, and it was always kind of a comedy, the rehearsals. So when I came back from my last visit, I decided I would find a tutor and learn Italian. And of course, my next date was canceled because of the pandemic. But that became a project during the pandemic, and my Italian not bad. And I was able finally to appreciate Boito's libretti,
Uh-huh.
and particularly for Falstaff, how he took the Shakespeare, those two Shakespeare plays, Falstaff and Merry Wives of Windsor, and folded them in both structurally and then his use of language. So I would say that, you know, Falstaff for sure, and Othello, although I don't know Othello as quite as well as I do Falstaff. I know that there are other operas based on Shakespeare, but I can't think of one that really affects like those.
Do you have any thoughts about what you have this is a massive, massive undertaking. I mean, it's a great play, and you're doing this as a world premiere for a great American company. Do you have any thoughts about what's next? Are you the type of person that has to be completely finished before you start thinking about what's next? Or is there anything upcoming that you wanted to talk about?
You know, when I had finished Girls of the Golden West in 2017, I thought that was it. And then I got hooked into this one. So I wouldn't make any predictions. I'm surprised that I've ended up writing so many stage works because I can't sing. We never had a single word spoken in 6 years of college and graduate school in musical composition ever about the human voice.
Really?
All we did was study Schoenberg and Webern and Beethoven sonatas, but there was nobody on our faculty who knew anything about singing, with the exception of the young David Del Tredici, who did something about it. But you know, even with David, we didn't discuss singing, and I found that all of my colleagues, all my composer colleagues, never study singing. It's just not taught in the composition program. So you have a lot of composers, particularly in the United States, who are writing for voice. You know, they're writing song cycles, they're writing operas. Seems like everybody's writing an opera now, which is a good thing, but most of them, and I would say most, include myself, know very little about, you know, I didn't even know what the passaggio was when I started writing Nixon in China, you know, and John Dykers, who was our wonderful first Mao, said to me, how, you know, you've got me starting on my worst note. And, you know, I just don't know those things, but I've learned what we call the school of hard knocks over all these years, more about singing.
But your instincts are extraordinary, because in Nixon, for example, the Pat Nixon aria, "This is Prophetic," is one of the great pieces of vocal literature of the 20th century. And I think that the close of the first act of Dr. Atomic is, for me, is not far behind. I mean, I remember not watching it in San Francisco. I didn't see the premiere, but I saw one of the performances in the first week of the run, and realizing that I wasn't really breathing properly by the time he was done with it, because I was so focused on what was coming next. It was so spontaneous sounding. But
you know, I maybe just am lucky. I don't know. You know, I often talk about how I grew up. My mother really barely could read music. She had no musical or formal musical training, but she was intensely musical. And she learned everything by ear. And she sang in, you know, Oklahoma and Carousel and South Pacific. And so I grew up listening to her singing, and we had all those wonderful recordings of Ella Fitzgerald and the great jazz singers at home. So I guess I absorbed it, you know, it became part of my DNA, or was part of my DNA. And, you know, I do work with singers. I hear them struggling, and I make adjustments. But I think the thing is that one thing about the way I treat opera is I'm not interested in using the human voice to show off. Last thing in the world that interests me is Fioritura or the kind of fireworks that we found in the bel canto era, or even in Handel, who's a composer that I hold in enormous esteem. My inspiration has been great American pop singing, whether it's Stevie Wonder or Barbra Streisand or Louis Armstrong. I want the words to be intelligible, and I'm not interested in using the voice as some kind of virtuosic instrument.
It's interesting for me that you mentioned pop singing, because I think that tradition, certainly with like the Frank Sinatras or the Barbra Streisands, where they were reinventing the material that they sang fresh every time, is a very different tradition than what classical singing has fallen into, where I don't want to say it's imitative, but I think people in classical singing now are so worried about making mistakes. And I think that's, to me anyway, it's a barrier to expression, because when you worry about making the mistake, it's a hesitation. So that's a hesitation from connecting with the material and from connecting with the audience. And yes. Do you get a chance to work in rehearsals with singers on things like that?
I do. I'm not conducting. I don't like to conduct my premieres because there's so much to listen to and judge, but I will be doing future performances. I'm going to conduct the next production of this in Barcelona. And when I'm conducting, I'm able to, work more because I'm in control. And it is very, very difficult to sing my operas. It is, the phrase lengths don't fall into neat 4+4+4 patterns. The pitches, although I'm a tonal composer, sometimes they're hard to find. And I'm in pain watching these poor singers trying to learn this, and we have just incredible talented music staff in the San Francisco Opera who are they're just killing themselves to help staying late until 11 o'clock at night after a long rehearsal to coach a singer. It's not easy. But in the end, I think that they all find that there's a coherence to what I'm doing, and they get it. It'll be interesting. There's a production of Nixon in China coming up in Paris that Gustavo Dudamel is conducting, and it's Tom Hampson and Renee Fleming.
I know, yeah.
People whom I know and admire, and they've decided they want to do this. And neither of them have done my music before. They're both incredible musicians, but I know it's going to be a shock when they start grappling with the rhythms.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I mean, especially in that opera, it doesn't. I have to say that I'm not aware as a listener of how difficult it is, because there's a logic to it, as you say. I think, though, when I look at it on the page, all I can do is be grateful that I'm writing about it and not trying to sing it, because it reminds me a little bit of, not so much in sound, but Benjamin Britten, that when you look at some of his vocal music and you think, is that note wrong, or is it just to get the singer's attention going fresh? That there's never a surrender to melody. There's never a surrender to lyricism. Everything is always so well balanced.
Well, yeah, I admire Britten a great deal, and I perform his music. I don't much identify with his style of writing for the voice. There's some pieces of his that I love, but I think it's just my American background. That, you can't live in this country without hearing popular music all the time.
Of course.
Most of it's terrible, but that of it which is good is so deeply ingrained in our, our sensibilities that it comes out. With that said, I don't want your listeners to think that, if they come and hear Antony and Cleopatra, they're going to hear pop singing. Not at all. It sounds like opera, but I'm just talking about the approach to setting text.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at this point, that's all we have time for. But before we part, I want to remind you of one thing you said to me, which I thought was incredibly charming when we were at the Opera News Awards, when you were honored. It's over 10 years ago. And I told you how much I liked Dr. Atomic, and you turned to me and said, "Don't you think it's too long?" And I said, no, I didn't think so then. I don't think so now. And it's a privilege to talk to you and to listen to your music in the Opera House and elsewhere. So thank you very much, John Adams, for joining me. This is F. Paul Driscoll with Sightlines, and my guest has been the great American composer, John Adams. Thank you for watching.